For 62 consecutive Octobers, old Tinsy Garland had climbed the slope above Persimmon Creek at 3 in the morning under the full moon, and her neighbors in Rabin County, Georgia, had decided she was the Bloodroot Witch. They were wrong about what she was doing, but it had been 22 years since anyone in the valley had bothered to ask her. In October of 1902, the wife of the new Methodist circuit rider asked, "Rabin County, the second week of October, 3 o'clock in the morning, on the north slope of the creek." Tinsy was on her knees in the wet leaf mold, digging bloodroot with a wooden splint sharpened on one end. The moon was full and 3 days past, hanging just above the saddle of Rabin Bald, and the only sound on the mountain was the steady ticking of water off the chestnut limbs from a storm that had passed through at midnight. Her granddaughter Rhoda, 13 years old that summer, was behind her with a tin coffee can, lining the roots up the way her grandmother had shown her, big to small, root to root, taking care not to break the slender hairs at the tail end. By the time Tinsy sat back on her heels and pressed the heel of her hand against the small of her back, they had 19 good roots in the can. The 31 tobacco tins on the mantel shelf of her cabin, half a mile down the trail, were already labeled for what she would do with the 19 roots over the coming 12 weeks. And one of those tins, the one she had not opened for tumor work in nearly 4 years, was about to be needed for a woman she had never met. The reason she was there at 3 in the morning, and not at noon, when any reasonable person on the persimmon would have gone digging, was older than she was. And it was not the reason her neighbors had decided on. Bloodroot leaves, the wide, round palmate leaves that sit each one on its own stalk above the rhizome, carry a thin film of waxy compound on the upper surface that reflects moonlight back at an angle the human eye reads as a soft white glow. In a hardwood understory at full moon, with no torch and no lantern, the leaves are easier to find than at any hour of daylight. Tinsy's grandmother, who was Cherokee on her own mother's side and had been raised in the Snowbird Mountains before the removal of 1838, had taught her this when she was 11 years old. Her neighbors, 3 generations of them by 1902, had decided on a different explanation. The decision had not been a malicious one. It had been the decision of people who saw an old woman on a mountainside at 3 in the morning under a full moon, drew the simplest line they knew how to draw, and stopped there. By the time the Reverend Joseph Talmadge Hollings, 38 years old, ordained Methodist Episcopal Church South, arrived on the persimmon as the new circuit rider in April of 1902, the line had been there long enough that he did not understand it was a line at all. He understood it as the situation he had inherited. They called her the Bloodroot Witch of Rabin County, and they had been calling her that since approximately the year 1880, and there were people in the valley below who could not remember her actual given name without thinking about it for a moment first. The Reverend's wife was 33 years old. She had a tumor in her right breast that had grown 2 inches across since June, and an Atlanta surgeon had told her to wait and observe, and she had decided that observation was not what saved women in her situation. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, the Reverend rode up the trail to ask the Bloodroot Witch of Rabin County whether she would evaluate his wife. The Reverend Hollings made his first visit to Tinsy's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, several hours after she had come back from the slope and laid the bloodroot out to dry on a cheesecloth screen in her loft. He rode up on a bay mare he had bought from a Clayton livery for $19 in the spring, and he hitched the mare to the post in front of the cabin with the careful, slightly self-conscious nod of a man who had grown up in Atlanta and was still learning to ride. Tinsy was on the porch in a hickory chair, peeling the outer skin off a row of dried, slippery elm bark with a paring knife, and she did not look up when he came around the corner of the cabin. She let him get to the bottom step before she said, "Good afternoon, Reverend." He took his hat off. He had been told by old Albert Foxworth at the general store in Mountain City that this was the correct approach to Tinsy Garland, and he had remembered the instruction. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Garland," he said. "I hope I am not interrupting." "You are not. Sit down if you have a mind to." She nodded at the second chair, which was Rhoda's chair, and which Rhoda was not in because Rhoda was inside cutting up turnips for the evening soup. The Reverend sat down. He had a folded handkerchief in his coat pocket, and Tinsy noted the corner of it, white linen with a careful blue monogram. She did not say anything about it. She kept peeling slippery elm. "A woman your age," he said, And then he stopped because he had not entirely worked out the sentence in advance, and he was already aware, in the silence following the words, "your age," that he had begun the conversation in the wrong place. Tinsy did not help him finish it. She let the silence sit. After about 15 seconds, the Reverend tried again. "I am told you spend a great deal of time on the mountain at unusual hours." "That is correct. At night. Most often, yes." And in particular, he said, "I am told that you climb the slope behind this cabin at the full of the moon." "In October," Tinsy said. "Also in early September if the weather has been wet enough. The plant likes wet ground. It does not bloom in August because the leaves close in the afternoon heat, and the rhizome rests." The Reverend Hollings looked at her. He was by training a careful man. He had been a competent student of botany at Emory College, Oxford, Georgia, where he had completed his BA in 1893 before going on to the seminary, and he could identify approximately 40 native plants of the southern Appalachians by their Linnaean designation, which was about 38 more than the average Methodist circuit rider of his generation. He had not expected the woman everyone in Rabin County called the Bloodroot Witch to use the word rhizome. He recovered after a brief pause. "I am told," he said, "that the local people believe you choose those hours and that phase of the moon for reasons of a particular kind." "They do. Are they correct in their belief?" "They are not." There was another silence. The Reverend folded his handkerchief in his lap and unfolded it and folded it again. "May I ask what the actual reason is?" Tinsy set the slippery elm down on the porch boards beside her chair. She wiped the knife on the corner of her apron, which had a stain on it the color of dried blood and which was, in fact, dried bloodroot sap from the previous morning's work. Then she looked at him for the first time since he had hitched the mare. She had brown eyes, the kind of brown that has gold in the iris near the pupil, and they were perfectly steady and not at all unkind. "The leaves catch the moonlight," she said. "You can find the plant in the dark when the moon is full. You cannot find it in the dark when the moon is not. The plant grows under hardwood canopy, and the canopy is thinnest at the lunar maximum. It is a practical matter, Reverend. It is not a religious one." He absorbed this. He did not, to his credit, immediately argue. He looked at the apron with the bloodroot stain on it for a long moment, and then he said, "I see. You are welcome to come up the slope with me on the next full moon if you would like to verify the observation. I do not believe that will be necessary." "It is no trouble. I expect to be there." She picked up the slippery elm again. "But you did not ride up here to discuss the moon." He had not. He had ridden up here for two reasons, only one of which he had intended to disclose on the first visit. But the conversation had already shifted in a direction he had not predicted, and he found himself adjusting. He folded the handkerchief one more time. "Mrs. Garland," he said, "I am told that you sometimes prepare a poultice for tumors." Tinsy did not stop peeling slippery elm. The knife went on doing what it had been doing. "I have done that, yes. For what kinds of tumors?" "For the kind you can see and touch on the surface of the body. Not for the kind that grow inside, where I cannot reach them and would not know what was happening." "And the poultice consists of?" "Bloodroot sap, a small amount of red clay from the bank below the spring house. Linen, pulled tight against the surface. Changed every other day, watched carefully. The skin around it sometimes blackens, and that is the part of the process the patient finds the most alarming. But the blackening is the eschar, the dead surface tissue lifting away. Underneath, the tumor mass releases. The technique is 600 years old, and the Cherokee used it before the Scots-Irish arrived in these mountains. You will find it described without the spiritual decoration in Eli Lilly's Botanical Bulletin of 1898, which I have read, because Dr. Andrew Kelsey down in Clayton subscribes to the publication and lent me the issue. The Reverend Hollings did not speak for a long time. He had not expected the citation. He had not expected, in particular, the casual mention of Eli Lilly's bulletin, which he had also read, because he had subscribed to the publication himself during his last year at Emory, and had retained the issue in his trunk in the parsonage in Clayton. He had been carrying it under the impression that it represented a piece of professional knowledge that the Bloodroot Witch of Rabin County would not possess. "Mrs. Garland," he said, "I would like to ask you a question that does not concern the public at large. I would like to ask it in confidence." "That is your right, Reverend, She did not stop peeling. I do not generally repeat what is said on this porch. He hesitated. Then he said, if a woman of about 33 were to develop a tumor of the kind you have described, a tumor of the breast, palpable, slightly mobile, perhaps 1.5 inches in diameter, and if she had been told by a surgeon in Atlanta to wait and observe, would you, if asked, be willing to evaluate the case? Tinsy set the slippery elm down again. She looked at him steadily for the second time that afternoon. She did not ask what woman, and she did not ask why the Reverend Hollings was inquiring on her behalf, because she did not need to. She had identified the woman at the moment the Reverend folded his handkerchief for the 3rd time, which was a habit of nervous concentration that he had displayed at her at the parsonage at Esther Hollings's quilting bee in June, and which Tinsy, who had been present at that quilting bee with Rhoda, had filed away as a piece of information whose meaning was not yet clear. It was clear now. That would depend, she said carefully, on whether the woman in question wished to be evaluated. She does not yet know that I have come here. Reverend, Tinsy said, if you intend to bring me to evaluate a tumor in a woman who does not know you have asked me, I cannot help you. The first thing I would have to do is touch the place where the tumor is, and that is not something that can be done without consent. You will need to speak with your wife. The Reverend Hollings looked at the porch boards. The bay mare at the post shifted her weight from one back hoof to the other. From inside the cabin came the sound of Rhoda, who had finished cutting turnips and was now sweeping the floor with the corn broom Tinsy had made in September. Somewhere down the slope, a woodpecker began the slow, methodical work of opening a chestnut limb. The October light through the chestnut canopy was the gold amber of late afternoon, and it fell across the Reverend's bent head in a way that he was not aware of, and that Tinsy noted, because she noted most things. I have not yet been able to speak with her, he said quietly. That is between you and her, Reverend, not between you and me. He stood up. He put his hat back on. He took the bay mare's bridle in his hand and walked her 3 steps before he mounted, because the mare was still skittish at being mounted from the offside, and he had not yet figured out how to teach her otherwise. He sat in the saddle for a moment, looking down at Tinsy on the porch. Mrs. Garland, he said, may I come back? You may come back at any time, Reverend. I expect to be on this porch through the autumn. She paused. I do not, however, expect to be asked questions about evaluations of patients who have not consented to them. You may come back for tea or for conversation, or for whatever reason a Methodist circuit rider visits the older members of his parish, all of which I will receive with hospitality. But the question you asked me today cannot be asked again until the woman you are asking about has been told you are asking it. Do you understand me? He did. He turned the mare and he rode back down the trail to where the trail met the wagon road that led into Clayton, and he did not look back at the cabin. Tinsy watched him go, then she picked up the slippery elm and went back to peeling. After a few minutes, Rhoda came out onto the porch with a clay mug of sassafras tea in each hand and gave one to her grandmother. They sat on the porch together for a long time without speaking. The afternoon light moved across the slope and lengthened toward the spring house, and the chestnut canopy shed another scatter of yellow leaves into the corner of the porch where the broom had not reached. And somewhere above the saddle of Rabin bald, the half-light of the gibbous moon was already beginning to take its share of the sky from the sun. Tinsy Garland had been born Thomasina Owl on the western slope of Standing Indian Mountain in November of 1828, which would make her, by the autumn of 1902, 73 years and 11 months old. Her father was Caleb Owl, full Cherokee, born on the Hiwassee and removed to the western counties of North Carolina by the time he was 9. He had hidden in the woods above the Chiowa River during the removal of 1838 and had not gone with his people to the territory. He had married Tinsy's mother, Eleanor Garland, of the Welsh-descended Garlands of Rabin County, in the spring of 1826, and they had built a small cabin on a north-facing slope above the persimmon, 2 miles from where Tinsy's own cabin now stood. Tinsy had been their second child. Her older brother Samuel had died at the age of 4 of what was probably scarlet fever, though the diagnosis would not have been called that on the persimmon in 1826. She had married her first cousin Wesley Garland in the spring of 1846 when she was 17 and he was 21. and they had lived in the cabin she lived in now, which Wesley had built that summer with the help of his 3 brothers and his uncle Coleman, from chestnut logs cut on the slope above the spring. Chestnut logs, in 1902, were already a piece of vanishing history, because the chestnut blight, Cryphonectria parasitica, had been first reported in New York in 1904, and would, by the 1920s, have killed every standing American chestnut in the Appalachian Range. The cabin Wesley had built for her in 1846 was made of a wood that would soon be effectively extinct, and it would stand on that slope, in good condition, until the County Historical Society took possession of it in 1949. I have walked the path to that cabin. The chestnut sills are still sound. The wood resists rot in a way that 20th century lumber does not. Wesley Garland had been a blacksmith. He had set up a forge in a shed 20 yards down the slope from the cabin, and he had shod horses and mended plowshares for the families along the Persimmon and the Tallulah for 47 years. He had died in the second week of February in 1893 of what the family Bible records as lung fever and what was almost certainly bilateral pneumonia following an influenza infection. He had been 68. The pneumonia had taken him in 9 days. Tinsey had treated him for the first 6 with pleurisy root tea and slippery elm decoction and steam from a kettle of water and sassafras root that she kept boiling beside his bed. He had improved on the 7th day. He had relapsed on the 8th. On the morning of the 9th, Tinsey had walked the 2 miles down the trail to the church at the foot of the mountain and arranged for the funeral. She had buried him beside their daughter Lucinda, who had died of typhoid in August of 1881 at the age of 7, under a young chestnut tree at the eastern edge of the cabin clearing. The chestnut tree, like the cabin, had been gone since the blight, but the 2 graves were still there, marked by 2 smooth limestone headstones that Wesley had cut himself in 1882 for Lucinda, and that his brother Coleman had cut for him in 1893. Tinsey had marked the day of Wesley's burial in the family Bible in pencil. She had not visited the graves in the manner that some people visit graves. She had visited them in the manner of a woman who had lived for 50 years in sight of them, and did not consider the distance between the cabin and the headstone particularly meaningful. She had 2 living children in the autumn of 1902. Her son Daniel was 49 and farmed 200 acres of bottomland on the Tallulah, 3 miles below the falls. Her son Levi was 44 and worked as a logging foreman at the chestnut and yellow pine operation that one of the regional lumber companies had opened on the western slope of Rabin Bald in the late 1890s. Rhoda, the granddaughter who lived with her, was Daniel's youngest daughter, and she had come up to the cabin in March of 1902 because she had a steadiness her mother did not have the patience for, and Tinsey had agreed to let her stay through the autumn to learn the apothecary. The apothecary was the reason almost anyone came up the slope to Tinsey's cabin, and it had been the reason almost anyone came up the slope to Tinsey's cabin since approximately 1860. The apothecary was a row of 31 tin boxes on the mantel shelf above the fireplace. The boxes had originally held tobacco of a brand called Mountain Dewdrop, which had been sold by Foxworth's store in Mountain City between 1885 and 1892, before the brand was discontinued. Tinsey had collected them as old Albert Foxworth's wife emptied them, and had washed them in the spring branch and dried them on the porch in the sun. She had labeled each one in charcoal on the lid, in a fine, even hand, with the Linnaean name of the contents: Sanguinaria canadensis, Asclepias tuberosa, Ulmus rubra, Hydrastis canadensis, Panax quinquefolius, Actea racemosa, Sassafras albidum, Betula lenta, Valeriana officinalis, Impatiens capensis, and 21 more. She could write the names because her mother had taught her to read and write in 2 languages by the time she was 8 years old: an English schoolbook on the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and the Cherokee syllabary that her father had carried with him out of the western counties as a young man. Most of her neighbors on the Persimmon in 1902 could not have written their own names in either alphabet. The 31 tins on the mantel shelf were her practical archive. They held the dried roots and dried barks, and dried inner leaves and dried flowering tops of the plants she had been collecting on the slopes of Rabin Bald and along the Persimmon and the Tallulah and the Chattooga since she was 11 years old. She knew where each one grew, and what month it was, at its highest concentration of active compound, at what soil depth its rhizome lay, and how to prepare it for use. She knew which combinations were unwise. She knew that bloodroot must never be packed in a metal container, because the alkaloid sanguinarine oxidizes against iron and copper and loses its potency within a week. She knew that pleurisy root tea must be brewed with cool water and steeped slowly and never boiled, because boiling destroyed the saponins that gave the tea its expectorant action. She knew that slippery elm inner bark should be harvested in the spring when the sap was rising, and dried slowly in a loft and never allowed to mold, because mold compromised the demulcent. She did not know any of these things by the names that modern pharmacology would later assign them. She knew them by what she had seen in patients over 50 years of watching what worked and what did not. The names came later, in a long afternoon in 1968, when her great-granddaughter Cassie Brewer, who was then 23, sat at the same trestle table in the same cabin and described the contents of the same 31 tins to a young man from the Foxfire Collective named Daniel Hahn, who was recording the conversation on a Wallensack reel-to-reel. The recording is in the Berea College Appalachian Archive. Cassie's voice is steady. She knew everything her great-grandmother had known, and she did not pretend to invent any of it. If you have valued this kind of account of the women who built apothecaries from tobacco tins and a Linnaean education they were not supposed to possess, who learned bloodroot from Cherokee grandmothers and slippery elm from Welsh aunts, and who carried the working knowledge of an entire mountain pharmacopoeia in their heads through 4 wars and 7 epidemics, and the slow arrival of coal and timber companies on slopes that had belonged to their families for 120 years, please make sure to subscribe. The mountain remembers what the valley has forgotten, and we are working through the remembering one widow at a time. The Reverend Hollings did not come back for 10 days. He had not, in those 10 days, spoken to his wife. He had intended to. He had sat down at his desk in the parsonage in Clayton on the Wednesday morning following his visit to the persimmon, and had taken out a sheet of paper and had drafted 3 different versions of the conversation he meant to have. And on the Wednesday evening, he had burned all 3 drafts in the parlor fireplace, because none of them sounded like the kind of thing a man says to his wife when the question is whether she is willing to have her body examined by a Cherokee-descended widow on a remote mountain who is locally believed to traffic in something the Reverend was not yet sure how to characterize. What stopped him was not exactly fear, and it was not exactly pride, though both were involved. What stopped him was the slightly worse thing, which was the suspicion that if he raised the subject at all, Esther would assume the worst about the lump that she had been carrying without comment in the lower outer quadrant of her right breast since June, and that the worst, on the available evidence, was probably correct. He had married Esther Carlyle in May of 1893, on the day after his ordination, and they had been together for 9.5 years, and in those 9.5 years, he had never seen her frightened of a medical fact. He was reasonably certain she was not frightened of this one either. He was reasonably certain that she had already drawn her own conclusion and was carrying it alone, because she did not want him to have to carry it. The Atlanta surgeon Esther had consulted in late August had been a man named Charles Phelan, M.D., of the staff of Grady Hospital, and Phelan's recommendation had been to wait 6 months and reevaluate. He had explained to Esther, with the courteous and patronizing precision of a surgeon explaining medicine to a minister's wife, that surgical excision of a mass of that size and character would involve a degree of disfigurement that would significantly affect a woman's appearance and her marital relations, and that, in his experience, approximately 40% of such masses regressed spontaneously over the course of 6 months, and that in light of the uncertainty involved, he could not in good conscience recommend the operation at this stage. He had given her a small printed pamphlet on dietary management of fibrous conditions. Esther had accepted the pamphlet with thanks. She had not told the Reverend on her return what Phelan had recommended. She had told him only that the surgeon had advised observation, which was technically accurate and substantively misleading, and the Reverend had let the topic close because he had not wanted to press her on the 2nd Tuesday in September. And then, he had not wanted to press her on the 3rd Tuesday in September either. And by the 1st Tuesday in October, he had decided to do his pressing somewhere else. That somewhere else had been the persimmon. He understood by the second week of October that this had been a coward's solution and a faithless one. And he understood also that Tinsy Garland's quiet refusal to discuss an evaluation without Esther's knowledge had been the kindest thing anyone had said to him since June. He resolved, on the Sunday following his visit to the cabin, that he would speak to Esther on the Monday morning. He did not speak to her on the Monday morning. He did not speak to her on the Tuesday morning either. On the Wednesday afternoon, Esther came into the parlor of the parsonage where he was reading a back issue of the Methodist Review, sat down across from him with the careful composure that she had been maintaining since June, and said, "Joseph, the lump in my breast has grown. It is now closer to 2 inches across. I have made my decision about what I would like to do, and I would like to discuss it with you this evening after supper." The Reverend Hollings closed the Methodist Review. He set it on the side table beside his chair. He looked at his wife of 9.5 years for a long moment, and what he saw in her face was not fear. What he saw was the same particular quality of steadiness that he had seen in Tinsy Garland's brown eyes on the porch 10 days earlier, and which he had been carrying in his memory all week without entirely understanding what it was. "Of course," he said, that evening after the supper dishes had been cleared, and the cook had gone home for the night, and the parsonage was quiet, Esther Hollings sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her and told the Reverend Joseph Talmage Hollings, ordained Methodist Episcopal Church South, that she had decided she would like to consult the widow on the persimmon whom the local people called the Bloodroot Witch. "I am told," she said, "that she uses a poultice that has been recorded by Eli Lilly's Botanical Bulletin, and that has been used by the Cherokee for several centuries. I am told that she is precise about the cases she will and will not take, and that she will not take cases she does not think she can help. I am 33 years old, Joseph. I would like to be evaluated by her. If she thinks she can help, I would like her to try. If she does not, I would like to know what she thinks before I decide what to do next." The Reverend Hollings did not at that moment tell her that he had already been to see Tinsy Garland. He had decided, over the course of the Wednesday afternoon, that this fact would have to be confessed at some point, but that the confession would be better delivered after he understood what Esther had decided to do and not before. So he listened. He folded his handkerchief once on his lap. He did not unfold it again. "I will write to her tomorrow," he said. "Thank you, Esther." "Yes, why have you decided this?" His wife of 9.5 years considered the question. She did not answer it immediately. She looked at the kitchen table, which had been built by her grandfather in 1871, and which had crossed Georgia twice in the back of a wagon, and which she had been eating breakfast at since she was a child, and after a while she said, "Because Dr. Phelan in Atlanta told me to wait 6 months and observe, and I do not believe that is the right thing to do. And because I have been asking around, quietly since June, about other women in similar circumstances, and the answers I have gotten do not suggest that observation is what saves them. And because the widow on the persimmon was a particular kind of person before she became what the local people now think she is, and I would like to meet her as that particular kind of person, and not as the other kind." The Reverend Hollings, for the third time in 11 days, did not speak for a long time. When he spoke, what he said was not, in any sense he could have articulated in advance, what he had expected to say. "Esther," he said, "I went to see her 10 days ago. I did not tell you. I asked her if she would evaluate a tumor in a woman of about 33, and I did not name you. And she identified you within 30 seconds because she had seen me fold my handkerchief at the quilting bee in June. She told me she would not evaluate any patient who had not consented. She told me that if I wanted her to come, I would have to speak with you first." Esther Hollings considered this also. She did not, the Reverend was relieved to note, appear angry. She appeared, if anything, mildly amused, which was an expression that the Reverend had not seen on her face since the second week of June. After a moment she said, "Well, that is very much what I have been told about her by the women in the church. You will not be cross with me. I will not be cross with you. You are trying to do something that you found difficult. You did it incorrectly. We will not discuss it further than that." She paused. "What is she like?" "She is," the Reverend said, "extremely sharp. She read Eli Lilly's bulletin in 1898 because the Clayton physician lent it to her. She uses the word rhizome correctly. She has 31 tobacco tins on her mantel shelf, labeled in charcoal in Linnaean Latin. She would not let me ask her about you until I had spoken to you. I believe she is the most formidable person I have met since I left Atlanta. And I do not say that as a compliment to Atlanta. That is the woman I had hoped she would be, Esther said. Please write to her in the morning. The next morning was cold, and the path from the cabin down to the spring branch was slick with the first hard frost of October. Tinsy walked it alone at sunrise, with a wooden hoe over her shoulder and a coil of brown linen cord around her wrist. Rhoda was still asleep in the loft. The Reverend's letter had not yet arrived because the Reverend had not yet posted it, although Tinsy did not know this, and she would not have hurried her mourning if she had. She had a patch of sanguinaria she had been protecting on the upper bank of the spring branch since approximately 1878. The patch was about 30 feet across at its widest and contained, by her last careful counting in September of 1901, 247 individual rhizomes. She did not harvest from the patch in October. She harvested from the slope above the cabin in October, because that slope ran south-southwest, and the leaves there finished their season earlier and the alkaloid content peaked first, which was why she had been digging there at 3 in the morning 2 days before. The upper spring branch patch ran north and was a week or so behind, and in any year when she anticipated needing a particular quantity of fresh sap for a particular purpose, the spring branch patch was where she went, because the rhizomes there were larger and the sap was thicker, and the patch could afford the loss without endangering its 3- and 4-year successors. She walked along the upper edge of the patch in the cold sunlight and counted 251 rhizomes, 3 more than the previous year, which meant the patch was slowly, by its own internal economy, expanding. She marked the 11 rhizomes she would harvest if and when the time came with small twists of brown linen tied to the base of the leaf stalk. She left the brown linen and walked back up the trail to the cabin. The whole exercise took her about an hour. She did not say anything aloud during the hour. She did not, on the way back, particularly think about the Reverend's wife. She thought about the soil in the patch and about the way the chestnut leaves had been falling unusually early this year, which she had noted in the family Bible on the same page where she had recorded Wesley's death, because the family Bible was the only ledger she kept, and seasonal patterns were the kind of things she wanted to be able to compare against later. When she got back to the cabin, the sun was full on the porch, and Rhoda was at the kitchen table grating dried sassafras root into a wooden bowl. The grating produced a particular smell that Tinsy had associated since the 1850s with the beginning of cool weather and the start of the autumn brewing season. She took her shawl off and hung it on the peg by the door, and went to the mantel shelf and lifted down the tin marked Sanguinaria canadensis. She set it on the kitchen table. She lifted down the tin marked Asclepias tuberosa, the tin marked Ulmus rubra, the tin marked Hydrastis canadensis, and the tin marked Sassafras albidum, and she set them in a row on the table next to the first one. Rhoda watched her without stopping the grating. "Are we going somewhere?" Rhoda said after a minute. "No, not today. Maybe in a week or so. Down to the valley, maybe." Rhoda nodded and went back to grating. She had been with her grandmother since March, and she had learned, more or less in the first month, that Tinsy did not particularly like questions, and did not particularly mind them either, and would answer them in her own time if she answered them at all. Rhoda was, by temperament, well suited to this. Her mother, Daniel's wife Mary, had described her at the age of 8 as the kind of child who could sit in a corner for an hour with her own thoughts and be perfectly content, and the description had become, by 13, somewhat more pronounced. She was a steady, slow-moving girl with her grandfather's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she had inherited from her grandmother somehow, by a route that nobody in the family had bothered to track, the quality of being able to hold information in her head for long periods without needing to act on it. This was useful in the apothecary, where most of what Tinsy did was hold information in her head for long periods without acting on it. She would notice in May that a particular slope had developed an unusually large patch of jewelweed, and would file the observation away and not return to the slope until July, when she would harvest. She would observe in August that a particular family on the Tallulah had 3 children with the kind of pallor that suggested anemia, and would say nothing until October, when she would happen to be passing through the bottomland, and would mention, in passing, to the mother of the household, that ginseng tea brewed weak and given to children in October and November and December had a strengthening effect that she had observed in her own family for 50 years. The mother of the household would not necessarily act on the suggestion, but she would remember it, and in some cases, she would return to Tinsy the following spring and ask for a quantity of dried ginseng, which Tinsy would give her for the price of 2 laying hens, or a pound of butter, or, on one occasion in 1896, for nothing at all. What Tinsy was thinking about, on the morning of the second Thursday in October of 1902, was a problem that had nothing to do with Esther Hollings, although Esther Hollings was the occasion of it. She was thinking about her daughter Lucinda, who had died of typhoid in August of 1881 at the age of 7, and about the rule that Tinsy had set for herself in the spring of 1882 and had not broken since. The rule was that she did not treat children under the age of 12. She did not advertise the rule. She did not explain it to people who came up the slope with sick children. She simply did not take the cases. When a mother appeared at her cabin with a child under 12, Tinsy would examine the child, give the mother an opinion about what was happening, suggest a course of basic care that the mother could administer herself, hand over a small quantity of the relevant herb from one of the tins, and tell the mother to return to her own cabin and care for the child there. She would walk down the next afternoon to check on the child if the case was serious enough to warrant it. She did not prepare elaborate preparations for children. She did not, in particular, prepare bloodroot poultices for children, although the rule was easier to maintain in that case because bloodroot tumor work was almost never indicated for a child. The reason for the rule was Lucinda, and the reason for Lucinda was Wesley. In August of 1881, Lucinda Garland, 7 years old, had contracted typhoid from the spring branch, which had been contaminated upstream by the failed septic of the Carlisle family 2 miles above on the same drainage. Tinsy had identified the typhoid on the second day. She had begun a course of sassafras decoction, slippery elm tea for the dehydration, and cool sponging for the fever, which was the protocol she had used successfully on 3 adults the previous summer. On the 4th day of Lucinda's illness, the fever had spiked to a level that Tinsy estimated at about 104, although she had not owned a thermometer in 1881 and was making the estimate from the surface of her daughter's forehead and the dryness of her mouth. She had told Wesley that she wanted to begin a stronger intervention, which was a low-dose tincture of black cohosh, combined with cold water enemas to bring the fever down. Wesley had said no. He had said no, in approximately those words, on the porch of the cabin on the afternoon of August 15th in 1881. He had said that the fever would break on its own, the way fevers did, and that he was not going to allow his 7-year-old daughter to be administered enemas of cold spring water in the parlor of the cabin he had built her, and that Tinsy had been treating their daughter for 4 days, and that the treatment had not worked, and that the time had come to send for Dr. Sturdivant in Clayton, who would arrive on horseback by the next morning, and who would assess the situation in a manner that did not involve cold water or black cohosh, or anything else of which the Clayton physician would disapprove. Tinsy had not argued. She had not, in particular, told her husband of 26 years that she was confident in the black cohosh intervention, and that the delay of 12 to 16 hours involved in sending for Sturdivant might be the difference between her daughter recovering and her daughter not recovering. She had not said any of that. She had simply said, "All right, Wesley." And she had sat with Lucinda through the night, sponging her forehead with cool water from the spring house, and she had watched the fever climb past what she estimated to be 105, and she had watched her daughter become first delirious and then unresponsive, and she had watched, in the small hours of August 16th, her daughter stop breathing. Dr. Sturdivant had arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning of August 16th. He had been brisk and efficient and very kind, and he had taken his hat off in the cabin, and he had pronounced the death, and he had given Wesley a brief lecture about the importance of summoning medical assistance promptly in cases of fever. He had not said, to Tinsy or to Wesley anything about cold water enemas or black cohosh. But on his way out to his horse, he had paused briefly on the porch and had said to Tinsy, in a low voice that Wesley did not hear, that he was sorry, and that what she had been planning to try would have been worth trying, and that he himself had used a similar protocol on a typhoid case in Habersham County the previous spring with a positive outcome. He had not said this in a way that was meant to be cruel. He had said it in the way that one practitioner says it to another when an outcome has gone the wrong way, and the only remaining decency is the acknowledgement that the failed intervention would not have been a foolish one. Tinsy had thanked him. She had buried her daughter the following afternoon, under the chestnut tree at the eastern edge of the cabin clearing, and she had not raised the subject with Wesley, then or in any of the 11 years and 6 months of marriage that remained to them. Wesley had grieved for Lucinda in his own way, which was largely by working longer hours at the forge and by speaking less in the evenings. He had been a decent man and a kind one, and Tinsy had loved him without reservation for 47 years, and what had passed between them in the cabin on the night of August 15th, 1881, had not changed any of that. It had simply settled, inside her, as a piece of information that she had not been able to act on at the time, and that she had decided afterward she would not put herself in a position to act on again. She did not treat children under 12. The rule was hers, and it was private, and it had held for 21 years. What it meant, by the autumn of 1902, was that the apothecary on the Persimmon offered limited service to mothers of small children. Most of the families along the creek and along the Tallulah understood this without having it explained. They went to Tinsy for the ailments of adults and the chronic conditions of the elderly, and they went down to Clayton for their children's fevers. And the arrangement had become so settled in the local pattern of practice that Tinsy was no longer asked to revisit it. She did not particularly want to revisit it. She did not particularly want to think about it in October of 1902 either. But the Reverend's question about Esther Hollings had stirred up something in her that she had not anticipated, which was the small, persistent question of why she was willing to attempt a difficult procedure on a 33-year-old woman she had never met, when she had not attempted, 21 years earlier, a procedure she believed in on her own 7-year-old daughter. The answer she gave herself, sitting at the kitchen table with the 5 tins in a row in front of her on the morning of October 9th, 1902, was that Esther Hollings was an adult and would consent for herself and would understand the risks and would not require Tinsy to go around the head of a husband who had a different opinion about what should be done. The answer was true as far as it went. It was not a complete answer. The incomplete part of it sat at the back of her mind, the way certain unresolved things do, and she did not pretend to herself that she had resolved it. She put the 5 tins back on the mantel shelf. She helped Rhoda finish the sassafras. She put the soup pot on for noon, and she did not, all of the rest of that day, think about the Reverend Hollings or his wife. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was brief. The Reverend wrote that he had spoken with his wife. He wrote that his wife had decided, of her own accord, that she would like to consult Mrs. Garland on the matter that he had previously raised. He wrote that his wife was prepared to travel to the Persimmon at any time of Mrs. Garland's convenience, or, alternatively, that Mrs. Garland was welcome at the parsonage in Clayton if she preferred. He wrote that he understood, given the nature of the consultation, that his wife's preference would be to come to the cabin, because the cabin was the place where Mrs. Garland kept her materials, and that he would accompany her on the ride up, but would absent himself from the examination if Mrs. Garland and his wife both preferred it that way. Tinsy read the letter twice. She wrote a reply on the back of an envelope from old Albert Foxworth's general store. The reply said that Mrs. Hollings would be welcome at the cabin on the following Tuesday at 11 o'clock in the morning, that Tinsy would expect the consultation to last approximately 2 hours, that the Reverend was welcome to remain in the cabin during the examination if his wife preferred, and that there was no charge for the consultation itself, although Tinsy would, if she undertook a course of treatment, expect to be paid for the materials at the going rate, which she would specify in advance. She gave the envelope to Rhoda's older brother Cyrus, who was passing through on his way down to Clayton to pick up a load of lamp oil for his father, and Cyrus delivered it to the parsonage on Thursday afternoon. The reply from the Reverend arrived on Friday, simply expressing his and his wife's thanks and confirming the appointment. It was during the Friday evening, after the reply had been read and after Rhoda had gone to bed in the loft, that Tinsy heard the knock on the cabin door. The knock came at about 9:45, which was unusual for the Persimmon, because almost nobody traveled the trail in October after full dark, except in a genuine emergency. And the knock did not have the urgency of an emergency. It was a quiet, deliberate knock. The knock of someone who was not certain he should be there, but who had made the decision to knock anyway. Tinsy opened the door. The Reverend Hollings was on her porch in the rain, which had started about an hour earlier, and he was not wearing his coat. He was wearing only a wool shirt over an undershirt, and the wool shirt was soaked through to a dark gray, and his hat was crushed in his right hand against his chest, and he was looking past Tinsy's shoulder into the dim light of the cabin rather than at her face. His hair was plastered flat against his forehead. The bay mare was hitched to the porch rail behind him, also soaked. "Reverend," Tinsy said, "come inside. Mrs. Garland, come inside. You are going to catch lung fever in the rain in October." He did not come inside immediately. He stood on the porch and he did the thing with the handkerchief, which he could not actually do because the handkerchief was wet and inert in his pocket. But his hand made the motion in his coat anyway, and Tinsy watched the motion and did not say anything about it. "Mrs. Garland," he said, "I have written up here because I have read something I would like to discuss with you, and I would like to discuss it tonight because Tuesday is too long to wait. Come inside." He came inside. Tinsy shut the door behind him. She fed 2 more pieces of seasoned oak into the fire in the hearth and crouched to bank them into the coal bed. She took the wet wool shirt off the Reverend's shoulders and hung it on the peg by the fire. She gave him one of Wesley's old shirts, which she had not given to anyone in 11 years, and which she did not particularly think about as she handed it over. And the Reverend put it on without comment over his wet undershirt because he was too cold to do anything else. Tinsy made coffee. She did not say anything during the coffee making. The Reverend sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the warmth of the tin mug and looked at the grain of the wood. "Mrs. Garland," he said, "Eli Lilly's bulletin from the late 1890s carried a clinical paper on escharotic treatments of cutaneous and subcutaneous mammary masses, performed in the Midwest by a small number of physicians, using a paste of Sanguinaria canadensis, combined with zinc chloride and a small quantity of stibnite, applied for several days and then re-evaluated. The series was not large, on the order of 12.5 cases. Most showed complete regression within 6 weeks. Several showed partial regression. 2 required surgical excision. I read it in seminary. I have kept the issue. I retrieved it from my trunk on Wednesday evening, and I read it again 4 times between Wednesday and tonight. Yes. I have a question about your preparation. Yes. You do not use zinc chloride. I do not. Why not? Tinsy sat down across from him. She poured herself a small mug of coffee. She drank a little of it before she answered. "Reverend," she said, "the Indianapolis method uses zinc chloride because zinc chloride is caustic, and because the combination of zinc chloride with sanguinarine produces a deeper and faster necrosis of the tumor mass than sanguinarine alone. The Indianapolis method also produces more disfigurement and a higher rate of secondary infection, and the lesion takes about 3 months to heal. The method I use, which is the method my grandmother taught me, and which her grandmother taught her, uses sanguinarine in a base of red clay and pressed against the tumor under a linen wrap. The clay slows the penetration. The penetration takes longer. The regression takes about twice as long as the Indianapolis method, which means it takes about 12 weeks instead of 6. The lesion heals cleaner. The scar is smaller. There is less risk of secondary infection because the clay is bacteriostatic, and because the slower penetration does not break the skin in the same way. I had not understood that distinction. It is not in Eli Lilly's bulletin, because the bulletin is summarizing a Chicago and Indianapolis surgical method. The Cherokee method is not in the bulletin. The Cherokee method is on the porches of women who learned it from grandmothers, and it has been refined over an unknown number of generations to produce the best practical outcome that the materials allow. The Reverend Hollings looked at his coffee. "My wife is the most important person to me in the world," he said. "I had assumed that. I have read the bulletin enough times now to know that whatever the difference is between your method and the Indianapolis method, both methods are likely to be more effective than waiting 6 months. Dr. Phelan's advice in Atlanta was not based on a review of the Indianapolis literature. It was based on his preference not to perform surgery on a young woman whose appearance he was reluctant to disfigure. That is also my reading of the matter. You will treat her. I will examine her on Tuesday. If I think I can help, I will say so. And if she consents, I will begin. If I do not think I can help, I will say so. And I will recommend the closest competent surgeon I am aware of, which is Dr. Stedman in Asheville, who has performed approximately 40 mastectomies that I know about, and whose outcomes are better than the average for surgeons of his generation. Thank you. You did not need to ride up here in the rain to ask me this, Reverend. I did. I needed to ask it tonight. He looked at her for the first time since he had come inside. He was a man of 38, and he had ridden a bay mare 3 miles up a wet mountain trail in October without his coat, and he was wearing the shirt of a blacksmith who had died in 1893, and he was sitting at the kitchen table of a woman whom most of his parish believed to be a practitioner of something he had not been able to characterize until that week. And what was visible in his face, in the dim light of the hearth fire, was the particular nakedness that Tinsy had seen perhaps 8 or 10 times in 73 years, on the faces of people who had stopped for the moment, performing whatever role they had been carrying. It was, she had observed across a lifetime of watching it, the only expression that was the same on the faces of men and on the faces of women, and the only expression that did not change with class or denomination or education. Reverend, she said, more gently than she had spoken to him at any point in the 11 days she had known him. Esther will be in good hands on Tuesday. I will do my best work. I cannot promise you what the outcome will be. The Mass is sitting in a quadrant where the result is sometimes excellent and sometimes is not, and I will not lie to you about that. But she will not be disfigured the way Phelan would have disfigured her. And whatever happens, the next 12 weeks will not be wasted, because we will know within 4 weeks whether the method is working. And if it is not, there will still be time to take her to Asheville before the Mass advances further. He nodded. He did not particularly attempt to speak. Drink your coffee. I will give you one of Wesley's coats for the ride down. You will return it next Tuesday. He drank his coffee. Tinsy went into the back room and took down Wesley's heavy oilcloth riding coat from the peg where it had hung since the spring of 1893, and she gave it to the Reverend without comment. He put it on over Wesley's shirt and over his own wet undershirt. The coat had been built to fit a blacksmith of Wesley's frame, and it fit the Reverend approximately, and the Reverend buttoned it and turned the collar up and went out to the porch where the bay mare was still waiting in the rain. Reverend, he turned. Tell her on the ride home tomorrow that I will be ready for her on Tuesday at 11. Tell her she may bring anything she likes for the consultation, including her own clothing to change into. The cabin is warm, and the examination will take place in the back room with the door closed. And you may sit by the fire and read Methodist Review if you like. I have it on the mantel shelf in the parlor, along with the bulletin from Eli Lilly. You may borrow either one. You have a copy of Eli Lilly's bulletin. Dr. Kelsey and Clayton gave it to me in 1899 when he moved to Athens and could not take his back issues. He gave me the 4-year run. They are on the mantel shelf with the family Bible. The Reverend Hollings did not say anything. He mounted the bay mare. He rode back down the trail to Clayton in the rain. Tinsy watched him until the bend at the Chestnut. Then she closed the door and went back to the kitchen and poured the rest of her coffee onto the fire and stood by the hearth for a long time looking at the bank of coals. It was during that long time with her back to the kitchen and her hand on the chestnut beam above the hearth that Wesley had set with his own hands in 1846 that she thought again about Lucinda. She did not think about her in the way she had thought about her earlier in the morning, which had been a sideways internal review of the question of the 21-year rule. She thought about her now in the way she thought about her on the night of Lucinda's birthday every year, which was that Lucinda had been born on the 13th of January in 1874, and would, on the 13th of January in 1903, have been 29 years old, and that Tinsy had no way of knowing what she would have looked like at 29, although she had a fairly clear idea of what she would have looked like at 29. From the fact that Lucinda had inherited Wesley's wide-set eyes and Tinsy's own narrow chin, and her mother Eleanor's hair. And the combination of those three features had a predictable adult expression that Tinsy could imagine without strain. She stood there for a while. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, and she opened the family Bible, and she wrote a single line in her careful hand on the page, facing the page where she had recorded Wesley's death. October 10th, 1902. Reverend Hollings's wife. She closed the Bible, she banked the fire, she climbed the loft ladder, and she found, in the dark, the blanket that Rhoda had kicked off in her sleep, and she straightened it over her granddaughter the way she had straightened the same blanket over Daniel and Levi 40 years earlier, and the way she had straightened a smaller blanket over Lucinda 28 times in 7 years. Then she lay down on her own pallet and she went to sleep, and she did not dream about any of it. Tuesday morning came clear and cold. Esther Hollings arrived at 5 minutes before 11, riding side saddle on a chestnut mare beside her husband's bay. She was wearing a dark gray wool traveling dress and a long wool cloak, and she dismounted at the cabin without help and walked up the porch steps with a small carpet bag in her right hand. The Reverend tied the 2 horses to the post and followed her at a respectful distance. Tinsy met them on the porch. Mrs. Hollings, Mrs. Garland, please come in. There is coffee on the stove and the back room is warm. Reverend, please make yourself comfortable in the parlor. Eli Lilly's bulletins are on the mantel shelf beside the family Bible, and the review is in the basket beside my chair. The Reverend nodded. He sat down in Rhoda's chair beside the fireplace. Tinsy led Esther into the back room and closed the door. The examination took an hour and 20 minutes. Tinsy palpated the mass. She measured it with a folded piece of cotton string against a wooden ruler. She examined the axilla and the supraclavicular fossa for lymph node involvement, which was the part of the examination that mattered most for prognosis, and which she had learned to perform on Cherokee women in the 1840s, from her grandmother, before either she or her grandmother had any English word for the procedure. She found one slightly enlarged node, which she noted but did not consider disqualifying. She asked Esther 7 questions about onset and progression, and discomfort and discharge, and family history, and Esther answered all 7 precisely and without flinching. She asked Esther one question about her marriage, which was whether she and the Reverend had been able to conceive, and Esther said no, and Tinsy nodded and did not pursue the question, because the answer was a piece of clinical information she had wanted and had now obtained, and because the further conversation was not her business. Then she explained the procedure she proposed. She explained the timeline. She explained the materials and the cost, which was 85 cents over 12 weeks, and which Esther insisted on paying in advance, and which Tinsy accepted in advance because she had learned long ago that people who had decided to do something difficult preferred to settle the small details immediately. She explained what would happen if the treatment failed, and she explained what would happen if it succeeded. She asked Esther if she had any further questions. Esther had 3. Tinsy answered them. "I would like to begin today," Esther said. "All right, please undress to the waist and lie on the cot." The first poultice took 23 minutes to mix and apply. Esther lay on the cot in the back room with her dark gray traveling dress folded on the chair beside her and her hair loose on the pillow. And Tinsy applied the bloodroot clay mixture in a thin layer over the mass and a wider margin around it. And she pressed a clean linen against it and wrapped it in 3 turns of brown linen cord. And she explained how Esther was to remove it in 40 hours and to leave the skin uncovered for 8 hours and to bring the linen back for the next application on Thursday morning. Esther listened. She nodded. She did not flinch at the procedure. She had, Tinsy noted with quiet appreciation, the particular kind of composed body language that competent patients have, which is a different thing from bravery, and which is the thing that, in Tinsy's experience, made the difference between a treatment that worked and a treatment that failed. They were back in the kitchen at 25 minutes past noon. The Reverend was in Rhoda's chair beside the fire, reading the 3rd quarterly issue of Eli Lilly's Bulletin for 1899. He looked up. He did not ask. Esther looked at him and nodded once, and the Reverend let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for an hour and 20 minutes. Tinsy made coffee for all 3 of them. They drank it without speaking for several minutes. Then Esther said, "Mrs. Garland, may I ask you a question that does not concern the treatment?" You may. You have a granddaughter living with you. I do, Rhoda. She is at her Uncle Levi's today helping his wife with autumn canning. Does she help you in the apothecary? She does. Will she carry the practice? Tinsy considered. She will carry some of it. I have not yet decided whether she has the temperament for the difficult cases. She has the steadiness. I am not yet certain whether she has the patience for the cases that take 12 weeks, and that may end badly. She is 13. I will know in 3 or 4 more years. I hope you will train her. I had assumed I would. The question is whether she will continue once I am gone. I will pray that she does. Thank you. I had been raised Methodist Episcopal South myself, although I have not attended a service in 18 years, for reasons that are between me and the Reverend's predecessor. I will not refuse a Methodist prayer for the continuance of the apothecary on the persimmon. It is a more useful prayer than most. The Reverend Hollings looked at his coffee. He did not, particularly, attempt to address the question of his predecessor. He understood that the question was settled, and that it had been settled by an earlier circuit rider whose name Tinsy had not given and probably did not intend to give. He drank his coffee. It was at 20 minutes to 1, while Tinsy was rinsing the coffee tins in the basin by the door, that the knock came. It was a hammering knock. It was the knock that does have the urgency of an emergency, and which the Reverend's quiet knock on Friday night had not had. Tinsy set down the tins and crossed to the door and opened it. On the porch was a woman Tinsy had known for 9 years, and had treated twice for chronic neuralgia. A woman named Sari Cottrell, 26 years old, married to Burl Cottrell, who farmed a small parcel of bottomland on the lower persimmon. Sari had her 6-year-old son Hooker in her arms. Hooker was wrapped in a blue wool blanket. His face was the particular dusky gray that Tinsy associated with severe laryngeal obstruction, and the sound coming out of his throat was the high, tight crowing of advanced croup, and he had been doing it, from the sound of his mother's breathing, for several hours. "Tinsy," Sari said. She was crying. I know your rule. I know you don't take children. The doctor in Clayton is in Tallulah at a confinement, and the doctor in Mountain City is sick himself, and I have walked 4 miles, and he is not going to make it home, Tinsy. He is going to die on the porch." Tinsy looked at the child. She looked, for 1/2 second only, at Esther Hollings, who was standing now beside the kitchen table with her hand on the back of the chair and her face perfectly composed, and at the Reverend Hollings, who had risen to his feet and was holding Eli Lilly's bulletin still open in his right hand. Then she looked back at Sari. The rule had held for 21 years and 7 months. It broke at 20 minutes to 1 on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1902, on the porch of the cabin Wesley had built her in 1846, in the presence of 2 witnesses she had not chosen and had not anticipated and would not afterward regret. "Bring him in," she said. "Lay him on the kitchen table. Reverend, put the kettle on, all the way full, no half measures." "Mrs. Hollings, the tin marked Asclepias tuberosa is the 3rd from the left on the mantel shelf. The tin marked Ulmus rubra is the 5th. Bring both of them. Sari, hold him upright. Do not let his head fall back. I will be back in 30 seconds. She went out the back door. She walked the 11 steps to the spring house. She came back with a copper pot of water that had been sitting on a shelf at 52 degrees since dawn. She set it on the porch. She had work to do. By 3 o'clock in the morning of October 15th, 1902, the kitchen of the Cottrell cabin was very quiet. The kettle on the stove was still on a slow simmer. The basin of sassafras and pleurisy root steam beside the bed had cooled to about 120 degrees, which was the temperature at which it was still working but no longer required tending. Hooker Cottrell, 6 years old, was asleep in his mother's arms in the cane-bottomed chair beside the stove. His breathing was even. The high, tight crowing of laryngeal croup that had filled the room at midnight had given way, over the course of the following 2 hours, to the slightly rasping but unobstructed breath of a small child who was tired and warm and no longer in any danger. Sari Cottrell had not let go of him. She had been holding him in that position for approximately 3¼ hours, and she had not shifted her grip. And her arm beneath his weight had gone numb at some point, and she was not particularly aware of it. She was 38 pounds of small child against her chest, and she was 41 years older than she had been at 1:15 in the afternoon of the previous day, and she did not at that moment particularly care about either of those facts. Tinsy was sitting at the cottrell trestle table with a tin mug of pine needle tea that Sari had made for her at 1 in the morning. Burl Cottrell had gone out to the barn at 2 to feed the milk cow, which he had not fed at the usual evening hour because he had been at the church meeting at the foot of the mountain when Sari had taken Hooker up the hill, and which the milk cow had reminded him about at intervals through the night. He came back into the kitchen at 3:05, hung his coat on the peg, and sat down across from Tinsy without speaking. He was 31, lean, dark-haired, and unaccustomed to being inside his own kitchen with a Cherokee-descended widow at 3 in the morning, and he had not, until that moment, known what to say to her. "Mrs. Garland, Mr. Cottrell, I had heard," he said, "that you did not take children. That is correct, until tonight." "Until tonight," he nodded. He did not press the question. He looked at his son in his wife's arms. He looked at the kettle on the stove. After a long moment, he said, "I will pay you whatever the rate is, when I am able. It may be a few months. The corn has not all come in yet. There is no rate. Pine needle tea is sufficient. Mrs. Garland, Mr. Cottrell. I came down the trail tonight because the situation required it. I did not come down because the case represented business. I will not be paid for it. Please do not raise the question again." He nodded. He did not raise the question again. He sat at the table with her in the silence of the kitchen for another half-hour, and they drank pine needle tea, and they listened to the steady breathing of his son in his wife's arms across the room. At about 3:45, Sari said, in a voice that was barely audible, that she thought she could put him in the bed without waking him. Tinsy helped her transfer the child. He did not wake. She covered him with the blue wool blanket he had been carried up the trail in, and she stood beside the bed for a few seconds, with one hand on his forehead, which was now the normal temperature of a 6-year-old child who was sleeping a sleep he had earned. Then she straightened, and she said quietly to Sari, "He will sleep for about 10 hours. When he wakes, the croup will be gone. There is nothing further you need to do tonight. You will stay until morning. I will stay an hour longer to make sure. Then I will walk back up the trail. It is dark. I have walked this trail in the dark for 50 years. It is not difficult." She sat at the trestle table for the next hour with Burl Cottrell across from her. They did not speak much. At 5:05, with the first gray showing in the eastern window over the woodshed, Tinsy stood up and put on her shawl and her shoes. Sari met her at the door. She did not say thank you. She did not, perhaps, know how to say thank you for what had just happened, and Tinsy did not require her to. Sari put both her hands on Tinsy's hands, briefly, and then she let go, and Tinsy went out into the cold, pre-dawn air and started up the trail toward the persimmon. She thought, on the walk up, about Lucinda. She thought about her in the way she had not let herself think about her in 21 years, which was not the sideways consideration of an unresolved question, but the direct acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, that had cost her her daughter, and that had set a rule in her practice for 2 decades, and that had been broken at 20 minutes to 1 on a Tuesday afternoon by a 6-year-old boy whose mother had walked 4 miles in panic, and whose father had been at a church meeting at the foot of the mountain, and who would, on the available evidence, be alive on Wednesday morning. She walked the 2.5 miles back to her cabin in the cold and the gray, and she thought about all of it, and she did not particularly arrive at any conclusion. The conclusion was not the point. The point was that the rule had not held, and the breaking of it had not produced the catastrophe she had spent 21 years protecting herself against, and that she was, on the available evidence, going to have to live the rest of her life with the question of whether the rule had ever been the right rule. She got to her cabin at 6:20. Rhoda was in the kitchen with the fire built up and a pot of coffee on. Esther Hollings was at the kitchen table. Tinsy had not expected Esther Hollings at the kitchen table at 6:20. She had assumed, when she had left the cabin at 20 minutes to 1 the previous afternoon, that the Reverend would take Esther back down to the parsonage in Clayton, and that the consultation would continue on Thursday, when Tinsy was scheduled to change the first poultice. The Reverend had, in fact, attempted to do this. Esther had declined. She had said, on the porch at 25 minutes to 1, with the rain not yet started but the sky low, that she had no intention of riding 3 miles back down to Clayton with a fresh bloodroot poultice strapped under a wool dress and bouncing on a side saddle, and that she would be staying at the cabin until at least Thursday morning, and that the Reverend was welcome to ride back to Clayton himself or to remain on the porch. The Reverend had remained on the porch. He had then, at about 1:30, when the rain had started to fall in earnest, ridden up the trail to find Tinsy at the Cottrells', and on being informed by Burl Cottrell that the case was serious and Tinsy would not be back for some hours, had ridden back to the Persimmon and sat in the parlor of his wife's cabin and read Eli Lilly's second quarterly bulletin for 1900 from cover to cover, while Rhoda, who had returned from her Uncle Levi's that afternoon and had been promptly informed of the situation, made supper for the Reverend and his wife and put them to bed in the loft. Tinsy absorbed this when she came in the door. Esther was in a borrowed wool wrapper of Rhoda's that did not quite fit her, and her hair was loose down her back, and the Reverend was visible in the loft above the kitchen as a wool-covered hump that was still asleep at 6:20. Rhoda was at the stove with the coffee pot. Mrs. Garland, Mrs. Hollings, the child. He will live. He will be himself by midday. He will not require further visits. I am glad. So am I. Tinsy sat down at the table. She accepted the mug of coffee Rhoda put in front of her. She did not speak for a few minutes. When she spoke, what she said was, I will need to change the poultice on Thursday morning. It is not necessary for you to remain at the cabin until then. The rain has stopped, and the trail down to Clayton is passable in dry weather. I would like to stay. You may. The loft is small. The Reverend will need to sleep in the parlor on the trundle bed I keep there for visitors. He has already volunteered. Tinsy almost smiled. She did not, quite. She drank her coffee. Mrs. Hollings. Yes. I broke a rule of mine tonight that I had not broken in 21 years. I gather that from what your granddaughter has told me. I do not particularly know yet whether I will continue to break it. The question is not settled in my mind. I do not think it needs to be settled in your mind tonight, Mrs. Garland. No, it does not. I am only telling you so that if at some point in the next 12 weeks I become difficult to engage with on the subject of practice, you will understand it is not related to your case. Your case I have decided about. I have not yet decided about the rest. Esther nodded. She did not particularly attempt to press the question. She had grown up the daughter of an Atlanta cotton broker who had himself been raised on a hill farm outside Athens, and she had learned, from a father who had spent his life around men who needed time to settle questions, the value of allowing time to do its work. She put her hand briefly on the back of Tinsy's hand, the way she had put her own hands on Tinsy's after the examination on Tuesday afternoon, and then she withdrew it, and she drank her coffee. The Reverend Hollings came down the loft ladder at 7:15, looking like a man who had not slept particularly well in someone else's bed, and who was attempting to absorb the situation of being in his shirt sleeves in a kitchen on the Persimmon, with his wife in another woman's wrapper at the breakfast table. He sat down at the table. Rhoda gave him coffee. He thanked her gravely. He did not immediately attempt conversation. After a few minutes, he said, Mrs. Garland, Reverend, the child, he will live. The case was straightforward once the steam was applied. Pleurisy root steam relaxes laryngeal spasm because the saponins act on smooth muscle. Slippery elm tea coats the throat. The two together work as well as anything Dr. Phelan in Atlanta would have given the same child, and rather faster than the diphtheria antitoxin Dr. Sturtevant's successor in Clayton uses these days when he can get it. I see. You may, when you ride down to Clayton on Friday, mention to Dr. Hutchins in the back office of the dry goods that pleurisy root steam is worth keeping in mind for cases of obstructive croup, where the antitoxin is not available. He is a young man, and he is open to suggestions. He will probably make a note. I will mention it. I would prefer you not to mention where the suggestion came from. Of course. Tinsy drank the last of her coffee. She stood up. She put on a clean apron, the one that did not have the bloodroot stain on the front, and she crossed to the mantel shelf and lifted down the tin marked Sanguinaria Canadensis. She set it on the kitchen table. She set the small wooden bowl beside it. She set the small jar of red clay paste beside that. Mrs. Hollings, she said, Thursday morning is still 2 days away. The poultice will not be changed until then, But I would like, while we have you here this morning, to begin teaching Rhoda the procedure. She has watched the preparation. She has not been present for the application. I would like her to be present for the next 2 applications, with your permission, because if anything were ever to happen to me before this course of treatment is concluded, she would need to be able to continue it. Esther considered for a moment. Then she said, "Of course. She is welcome to be present, thank you. We will do it Thursday morning. This morning I would like only to walk her through the preparation, so that she has it in her hands once, before she sees it applied." Rhoda at the stove did not turn around. She did not say anything. She had, the Reverend noted, exactly her grandmother's economy with response, and exactly her grandmother's habit of receiving important information by absorbing it and not commenting on it. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to the table and sat down on the chair beside her grandmother. And she watched Tinsy open the tin of dried sanguinaria and tip the rhizome fragments into the bowl. And she did not ask any questions because the time for questions had not yet come. The poultice changes proceeded over the following 12 weeks at the rhythm Tinsy had described to Esther on the first Tuesday. The first change, on the Thursday morning, showed the expected blackening of the S-scar around the perimeter of the mass, which Esther had been warned about and which she absorbed without flinching. The second change, on the Saturday morning, showed slight softening of the central mass. The fourth change in the second week showed the first measurable reduction in the diameter of the mass. By the 6th week, the mass was approximately half its original diameter. By the 9th week, it was approximately a quarter. By the 12th week, on the morning of January 7th, 1903, the mass was no longer palpable, and the skin where it had been was healing under a thin layer of new tissue that Tinsy examined with quiet satisfaction and pronounced as having reached the end of the treatment cycle. Esther returned to the parsonage in Clayton on the afternoon of January 7th. She rode the Chestnut mare side saddle down the trail beside the Reverend's bay. She did not visit Dr. Phelan in Atlanta for re-examination. She did not need to. She did, however, in the spring of 1903, ride up to the persimmon at intervals of approximately 3 weeks, ostensibly for tea with Mrs. Garland, but in practice so that Tinsy could palpate the site every 21 days for the first 6 months and confirm that there was no recurrence. There was no recurrence. By the autumn of 1903, the visits became quarterly. By the autumn of 1904, annual. Esther Hollings lived until December of 1941, and the mass did not return. What the modern pharmacological literature now understands about why the bloodroot clay linen poultice worked on Esther Hollings's tumor, when Dr. Phelan's recommendation of observation would almost certainly have allowed the mass to advance to a stage where surgical intervention would have been required and would have been disfiguring, comes down to the cytotoxic action of the alkaloid sanguinarine on squamous and basal cell epithelial tissue. Sanguinarine, first extracted from the rhizome in the early 19th century and characterized in detail by Cushnie's pharmacology textbook of 1899 and its successive editions, intercalates with cellular DNA and disrupts cellular replication, preferentially in rapidly dividing tissue. Tumor tissue divides faster than the surrounding healthy tissue. The S-scar that forms under the poultice is the cumulative death of the upper layers of the tumor mass, while the surrounding healthy tissue, which divides more slowly, remains largely unaffected. The Cherokee method, with its red clay carrier, slowed the penetration of the sanguinarine in a way that the Indianapolis zinc chloride combination did not, which is why the Cherokee method took 12 weeks instead of 6 and produced a cleaner final result. The red clay also had a measurable bacteriostatic effect against the most common skin pathogens, because the kaolinite particles bind to bacterial cell walls and prevent attachment to the underlying tissue, which is why secondary infection at the poultice site was substantially less common in Cherokee method treatments than in the more aggressive zinc chloride methods, documented in the Indianapolis literature of the 1890s. The Cherokee women who had worked out the technique on the southern slopes of the southern Appalachians and the western North Carolina ridges over an unknown number of generations had refined the method on patients and had selected for the variations that produced the best outcomes by the same iterative process that the Indianapolis surgeons had used in the 1890s, only over a longer time horizon and without the institutional documentation. There were also things in the apothecary on the persimmon that did not work. Tinsley had used, in the 1850s, a tobacco poultice for earache in adults, and had observed by the 1860s that it did not particularly help, and had ceased to use it. She had used in the 1860s a mercury salve for what she had then been told was rheumatic skin condition, and had observed by the 1870s that the patients who received it did not improve, and had ceased to use it. She had once, in 1873, used a kaolin poultice for poison ivy, which had not been effective, and which she had replaced after observing the behavior of jewelweed at the edges of poison ivy patches on the slopes of Rabin bald, with a jewelweed crush that worked because of the saponins and a quinone-type compound in the plant tissue, both of which would later be characterized in 20th century botanical literature, but were not understood in any detail in 1873. She had also, on 3 occasions in her career, attempted bloodroot poultice on internal tumors that she could palpate through the abdominal wall, and had achieved no effect because the sanguinarian could not penetrate the intervening tissue at therapeutic concentrations, and she had recorded this in the family Bible after the 3rd attempt as a contraindication, and had not attempted it again. She had never claimed bloodroot would treat what it would not treat. She had been, by the standards of the patent medicine industry of her century, a startlingly honest practitioner, because she had practiced without an institutional incentive to overclaim, and had been accountable to a community of 240 people who would notice immediately if a treatment failed, and would adjust their willingness to come up the trail accordingly. The Reverend Joseph Talmage Hollings preached his first sermon at the small Methodist Episcopal Church South on the persimmon on the 2nd Sunday of February, 1903. The sermon was nominally on the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it was not a remarkable sermon by any conventional standard, but it concluded with a passage that did not appear in any prepared draft and that the Reverend had not written down in advance. The passage was brief, and it observed that the southern Appalachian Mountains had been settled by herb women, whose practical knowledge had been earned in a manner that the more credentialed practitioners of his own denomination did not always acknowledge with appropriate respect, and that he, the Reverend Joseph Talmage Hollings, had had occasion in recent months to learn this lesson at close range, and that he would not soon forget it. He did not name Tinsley. He did not particularly need to. Everyone in the congregation knew what he was referring to. They sang the closing hymn. The Reverend shook hands at the door. Several of the women who had not come up the slope to Tinsley's cabin in some years stopped briefly outside the church and considered the matter, and 3 of them rode up the trail the following week, with mild complaints of rheumatic conditions and the early aches of arthritis. And Tinsley examined them and gave them what she gave them, and the apothecary on the persimmon, in February of 1903, began to recover something of the standing it had had in the 1880s before the local nickname had taken hold. Tinsley was not present at the sermon. She was at the Cottrell's cabin that morning, teaching Sarah Cottrell how to prepare a pleurisy root steam from the dried rhizome in case Hooker, who had not had another croup attack since October 15th, but who was the kind of small child who might ever had one again. Burl Cottrell sat at the trestle table with them. He did not say anything. He had not, since October, said much of anything to Tinsley that was not strictly practical. He had also not, since October, allowed his wife to walk down to Foxworth's store in Mountain City without making sure she had a sack of dried sassafras and a paper twist of slippery elm bark from his root cellar in her basket. As a return courtesy to Tinsley, the arrangement was understood without being discussed. It continued for 6.5 years, until Burl Cottrell died of a logging accident in the spring of 1909, after which Sarah continued the arrangement on her own. Rhoda Garland turned 14 in November of 1903 and stayed at the cabin through the winter. She turned 15 the following November and did not go home. By the autumn of 1906, she had her own row of tobacco tins on a shelf below her grandmother's, and she had begun to take the simpler cases of her own under Tinsley's supervision. By 1913, she had married a Welsh-descended carpenter from McDowell County, West Virginia, named Garrett Brewer, and had moved to the Tug Fork with him, and had taken with her 7 of her own tobacco tins, and a copy in her grandmother's hand of the preparation method for bloodroot poultice. She practiced the apothecary on the Tug Fork until 1968. Her daughter, Cassie Brewer, who was born in 1945, married into a family in Mountain City, Georgia, and returned to Rabin County in 1965, where she carried the practice forward for another 50 years. It was Cassie's daughter, also called Tinsy, who in 1996, at the age of 23, donated the original 31 tobacco tins from the cabin on the Persimmon to the Foxfire Heritage Center in Mountain City, Georgia, where they are now displayed in a glass case on the second floor, under a small printed card that lists, in modern transliteration of Tinsy's charcoal labeling, the Linnaean designation of each plant and the condition for which it was prepared. The card does not say Bloodroot Witch. It says simply, the apothecary of Tinsy Garland, Persimmon Creek, Rabin County, 1846 to 1921. I have seen the case. The tins are arranged in 3 rows of approximately 10 each. The charcoal labels have faded